Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Greg Jennett with you this Tuesday from our Parliament House studios in Canberra here on Ngunnawal Country. And a quick shout out to Fran Kelly, who's feeling unwell today. Fran, we're wishing you a speedy recovery and she'll rejoin us just as soon as she can. Well, the Easter break has given the major party leaders an opportunity to fan out farther and wider than the first week. Scott Morrison's this afternoon wrapping up a visit to the West, where Liberals currently hold 10 of 15 federal seats. Anthony Albanese's sticking it out in Queensland, where his party's aiming to lift its stocks above the half a dozen seats held at the moment. They did this against the backdrop of pallid polling for both sides, those polls taken before and over the Easter weekend.
How you doing? Hey, how are you? Hi, mate.
We're meeting with veterans and pledging nearly $40 million in funding today.
How are we doing this? It's all
however you like, sir.
Okay. Quick safety brief. I have been underestimated my whole life. I will continue to put forward a really strong agenda for Australia's future, and that will contrast with this government that have nothing to say about the present.
Scott Morrison is giving a speech at a business breakfast this morning.
Mining industry had 3 years to tell you what their economic plan was, and they can't even remember what the unemployment rate is.
My opponent is running on fear and scare. He did that in 2019, and the truth is he got elected. He got elected without an agenda. My agenda is about optimism. Hello, how are you? Australian ingenuity in action. Timely that we're here at Tritium today, because the future is right here, right now.
The armchair critic who wishes to become the Prime Minister of Australia, and if he can't hack the campaign, I can assure you he won't go close to be able to run a country. Here we go. Oh, here we go.
29% of voters will choose to support a minor party or independent. Is it inevitable that Australians are looking at 3 years of horse trading politics?
Well, I think that would be a very uncertain and unstable outcome for Australia. Terrific. All right. Okay. That's not the stable and certain leadership that this country needs.
OK, so that's a bit of a snapshot of how the day looked and in part sounded. As for the substance of the arguments on day 9, well, we caught up with our travelling reporters covering the campaign, Nour Haydar in Brisbane and Stephanie Borys in Perth just a few moments ago. Nour and Stephanie, you're joining us from opposite sides of our vast continent, and I think in your case, Steffi, above the din of an enthusiastic Liberal campaign room. We'll come back to you in a moment, but Nour, Anthony Albanese first. It seemed today that he was noticeably more energised and stressing his optimism in his campaign appearances. That doesn't mean, though, does it, Nour, that Labor's done with its claim about some secret government plan to put all pensioners onto these cashless welfare cards, does it?
Yeah, good afternoon, Greg. Well, Labor has been promoting this claim that the coalition plans to move pensioners onto the cashless debit card for some time now. For those who don't know what this card is, it operates sort of like a regular bank card, except it restricts spending on things like gambling and alcohol and prevents people on it from withdrawing cash. It has been operational around the country in some communities. The government has sought to expand it more broadly, but that hasn't happened yet. Now, Labor says that the coalition, will be looking to try and, broaden this out and include pensioners. At this stage, it is only voluntary for those on the age pension. The government has repeatedly rejected that accusation. Labor points to comments made by the Social Services Minister, Anne Ruston, back in 2020 as the sort of justification for this claim. Now, it should be pointed out that, social welfare groups and Indigenous activists have long campaigned against the cashless debit card. Some, almost 80% of those who are on the card currently are from Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, and activists and advocates against the card say that it restricts people's freedom, it removes people's autonomy. There's no evidence that it's actually working to address the root issues that people face. Today, the Prime Minister said that Labor's claim that pensioners would be moved onto the card was a despicable lie. The Treasurer, Shadow Treasurer, I should say, Jim Chalmers, he said that the coalition couldn't be trusted and insisted that under Labor it would be abolished entirely. Take a listen.
Labor will abolish the cashless debit card. The government will keep it, and they've talked about expanding it. The Prime Minister during the course of this term, in September 2019, said that the cashless debit card commended itself to wider application. The Minister said, as Anthony just reminded you, in 2020, he talked about this being the national platform. Now, if people want to ask the Prime Minister if he's serious about this, he'll abolish the card, but he won't. Labor will abolish the cashless debit card. The Liberals and Nationals won't, and they've talked about expanding it. Those are facts.
Thanks for that update, coming to us loud and clear from Brisbane. Might be a little tougher for Stephanie Borys, though, in Perth, in the middle of a Liberal event there. But, Steph, the Prime Minister heard these claims of secret debit card plans for a day or so, but it's really only today that he took it head on. How did he go about that?
Yeah, good afternoon, Greg. So there have been a number of scare campaigns from both sides of the political parties. They're trying to gain votes at the upcoming election of May 21. As you can appreciate, it looks like it could even potentially be a hung parliament, so every vote counts this time around, and that's why we're seeing these dirty scare campaigns come out sooner rather than later. Now, Nour was talking about that scare campaign Labor's been putting forward about the aged care pension and suggestions that they would go on that cashless debit card. Scott Morrison today saying that's a despicable lie. He's also referred to comments from Council of the Ageing, Ian Yates. Of course, they're an organisation that represents older Australians. Ian Yates himself has also said that there's no such policy that's been put on the table. So the Prime Minister using other advocates and organisations to back his stance, saying that no, this is not a policy that the government is putting in. And as you mentioned there, it was quite a strong response. He's just trying to knock it on the head because there is that concern from the Liberal side that Labor will still continue to push this, especially through social media outlets.
Even the ABC has found with fact check that it's simply not true. So Anthony Albanese can't ask Jim Chalmers or someone else who I saw yesterday still perpetuating this lie yesterday. If he wants to talk about trust and integrity, then he should show some today, and the Labor Party should stop frightening pensioners. It is an out-and-out disgusting lie.
Stephanie Borys from Perth and Nour Haydar in Brisbane. Thanks for those updates for Afternoon Briefing today. Now, well away from the Leaders campaign, Labor's also released its plans today for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and that was done by Shadow Minister Bill Shorten in Melbourne. He joins us from there now. Welcome, Bill Shorten, to Afternoon Briefing. For the half a million people who are on NDIS currently or might become new entrants, how quickly and noticeably would their experience of this scheme change under this package of measures that you've outlined today?
If Labor gets the privilege of being elected to form a government under Anthony Albanese, people will notice the change from day one. At the moment in Australia, 500,000 people receive individual packages of support under the National Disability Insurance Scheme. But literally thousands, Greg, thousands of people are stuck in the courts trying to fight against the Morrison government cuts to their packages. We want to do a blitz on the waiting lists so that people don't have to spend money on expensive lawyers. We want to resolve the outstanding issues, fix them, because we want to restore trust in the scheme. Yeah. And for the people who haven't had cuts, the problem is they're all worried that they will get cut. So I think a change of administration in the NDIS is just what was being ordered by thousands of people to give them security.
But isn't the key verb there review, or at least what I read to be a review, particularly the use of lawyers and consultants? If that was to be reviewed, it's not an experience that changes on day one, is it?
Oh, well, we'll start the process on day one. Clearly, the government's created such a traffic jam in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, you can't solve every problem, but we would start working from day one. The fact of the matter, Greg, is that this government has spent about $30 million in the last 8 months alone on high-priced lawyers to justify cutting people's packages. When I say cutting a package, let me use real-world examples. People who want a better quality wheelchair, people who are waiting to get a modification to their bathroom so they can have a shower, kids trying to get occupational therapy and speech pathology at the age of 7 so they have a better chance in life even if they have a diagnosis of severe autism. This is what's clogging up the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. It's unfair, it's causing a lot of anxiety, and you don't have to take my word for it. Just open up your switchboard at the ABC and I tell you the calls will come flooding in.
Yeah, no, we do receive a lot of feedback on it. In budgetary terms, though, Bill Shorten, this is on paper a cost-free policy. You've identified $30 million worth of expenditure on lawyers and consultants. Do you have an all-up number, though, as to how much could be saved once you go through this review or waste or whatever you call it?
Well, we need to win the election to be able to look under the hood. This government's very good at hiding key data, but I'm relying upon the experience of literally thousands of participants and their families and disability service providers. Currently, the government has allocated in their budget for our financial year 21-22 something like $31 billion in the scheme. Now, I'm sure that with more competent management, with reducing the red tape, without having to get people with permanent disability to have to prove every year, get a new medical report to prove they're still disabled, which is quite a demeaning process. I'm confident there's low-hanging fruit here. The extent of it, though, will depend
to what extent,
upon what we see.
5%, 10%, big budget, as you say, $31 billion. Do you have a back of the envelope? If you're talking about waste, just how much of that low-hanging fruit there is?
Now, I can point to individual problems, but the extent of the incompetence I don't think we're fully going to see till there's a change in leadership. The NDIS is now on its 7th minister. The reality is that Liberals in government see the NDIS portfolio as either a sin bin for disgraced ministers or a retirement lounge for Liberal politicians seeking to retire. What this program needs is people who are actually really interested first and foremost in people with disability, and that's what Labor would do. We want to involve people with disability at all levels of the Disability Insurance Agency. We want to talk to families and people with disabilities about how we get the planning process right, because at the moment, if you're trapped in the maze of the NDIS, for some people it's like a second full-time job, and for many people it's tiring and exhausting and debilitating. That was never the original aim of the scheme.
Yeah, it is a multi-pronged policy. We won't go through each and every element. In fact, I might get you to step back, Bill Shorten, if you can, to previous role, that of leader. You prosecuted what was derided by the government of the day as a Medi-Scare campaign. Did it work? Was it effective in its own way?
Oh, do you mean the government's lies about us or our warning to people about trusting the government?
The original prosecution of the argument before, they tried to shoot it down. I want to ask you that question for pretty obvious reasons, because the government reckons there's a replay of this around cashless debit cards today.
Oh, if you want to watch a campaign of a political party telling porky pies, I think we don't need to go back beyond Mr Morrison's 2019 campaign. I'm sure, Greg, in fact, I'm completely sure, I'll even bet you a $20 on this, that Mr Morrison promised Australians that he would introduce a National Anti-Corruption Commission.
He did.
Now, what's happened to that? We're not scaring people. This just happens to be the truth.
So you're personally convinced they have
government,
a back pocket plan to convert 4.5 million pensioners and welfare recipients in this country onto some sort of cashless debit card. You're personally convinced of that?
Oh, I wouldn't trust this government with the social security safety net, and I'll use some examples to support why I don't trust the government. Mr Abbott said he wouldn't touch the assets test for pensioners to be eligible for the pension, and yet when he got elected, they reduced they made it harder for pensioners to be able to access the pension. The government, every year for years while I was leader, used to promise at budget time a blitz on the welfare cheats. I think the embattled and disgraced Alan Tudge said that he would hunt you down and find out if you were, getting welfare payments, and they were going to use the robo-debt algorithms to do so. The problem is that whole scheme was illegal. I've never seen a situation where people on the safety net haven't been the pinatas or the pin cushion for a coalition government trying to magic up rubbish welfare campaigns against the more vulnerable in our society.
Right. So
do I trust the government when it comes to welfare crackdowns? No, I don't trust them at all.
Right. Well,
and
if you harbour such
I
suspicion, and given the importance of the pension to so many vulnerable Australians, why wasn't this raised more forcefully before we got into campaign proper? I think our bureau here was able to trace that some backbenchers, at least, were talking about this on social media. This is Labor backbenchers, 8, 9, 10 months ago now.
That's right. But when you ask me why I don't trust the government when it comes to the safety net for our vulnerable Australians, I helped organise the class action on robo-debt, and the government said I was making it up. They said this is just another Labor scare campaign. Well, I tell you what, Greg, on the door of the federal court, when the trial was finally going to be heard and government ministers and senior bureaucrats were going to have to give evidence, magically they settled for $1.9 billion. They acknowledged there'd been illegal claims made against nearly 500,000 Australians. So that's why we're having a royal commission into robo-debt. So when you ask me, Greg, why don't you just trust the government when it comes to punishing and picking on the vulnerable in our society? This crew have form. They have form. And robo-debt's exhibit number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah, it certainly was an expensive policy excursion, and you were intimately involved.
It was illegal. It was actually...
Well, yeah.
It was illegal and unauthorised, actually.
Yeah, no,
it was breaching the law. It wasn't... Thank you.
The trajectory in polls, just finally, Bill Shorten, it's hard to discern... One, if in fact there is a trend, so why is the campaign stubbornly not working for either side in your assessment so far, a week and a bit in?
Well, it's a bit early to predict the result. I wouldn't put the binoculars down.
No one's shifted the dial much, though, have they? Neither yours nor the government's.
Well, we'll find out when the votes are actually counted. I think Australians are weighing these measures up. They engage in the first few days. There's now school holidays and Easter, and we've got Anzac Day coming up. I've got no doubt that Australians are actually listening to the issues. Mr Morrison's strategy is to make you forget about the last 3 years and just think about the last 3 days. But people have now got the lived experience of Prime Minister Morrison over the last 3 years. And that's why I think ultimately Australians will choose Anthony and Labor, because this other bloke's been in, and we didn't roll out the vaccines as well as other countries. We eventually got there courtesy of our health system and health workers. The booster shots were slowly rolled out. I mean, rapid antigen tests, it's only in January that we're all running around to be able to get RAT tests so that people could just get back to some form of normal. And Mr Morrison, he had one job, and we didn't quarantine properly and we didn't roll out our vaccines. And, I think at the end of the day, Mr Morrison wants us to forget about his history. And I'm not sure Australians will fall for that.
Yeah, whether we're talking about polls or, in fact, the real primary vote on the 21st of May, what, in your judgment, because you've been around a while, what do you reckon's the floor at which a Labor opposition must secure a primary vote to be truly competitive on the day? Clearly, it was below that floor for you 3 years ago. About 37%, you reckon?
No, I think it's enough primary votes to win 76 seats. And we will see there's third parties. I mean, a lot of the right-wing third parties are just a front for the Liberal Party. You vote for one of the cranky right-wing parties, but then you end up preferencing the Liberals, so you're not actually making a protest. If you want genuine change in Australia, action on climate, a proud manufacturing industry, lower childcare prices and a better energy system, then you vote for Labor. But that's the contest. We've got to make the case. And if you want a better national disability insurance scheme, true to its original objectives, giving choice and control, well, then certainly there's only one alternative. Well, that's Labor.
Point made. All right, Bill Shorten, thanks for joining us on Afternoon Briefing. We'll see if we can't do it again.
Good to catch up.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Out. Bill
I'd like to.
All right, so time now to check in with two former ministers who between them have toiled through more than 4 decades of federal election campaigns. Joining us as they did last week, a former Liberal minister, Christopher Pyne. He's in Port Moresby today. And from the Labor side, Craig Emerson, a one-time trade minister amongst other responsibilities. Welcome back to both of you. And I think we're just resolving a couple of technical issues before we fire off the first question. But I might go to you, Craig Emerson, because I imagine Port Moresby has its own technical difficulties. Why don't we start with the opinion polls, Craig? Nothing much shifting the dial, as I was just discussing with Bill Shorten. Any thoughts on why that's the case just 9 days in?
Well, the news poll actually has a two-party preferred vote to Labor of 53-47, but immediately having said that, I wouldn't, say that means that that's going to be the result in almost 6 weeks' time, which is another part of my answer to you. Really, I don't think that Australians who have not yet made up their minds would be scouring through the newspapers, online, even this wonderful program every day saying, oh, I don't know which way to go, I don't know which way to go. They would be tuning in but not really focusing at this stage because it is such a long campaign. We've almost got 6 weeks to go if my arithmetic is right. Please correct me if it's wrong, but that's a long time. And, we've been through Easter, we've got an Anzac Day holiday coming up. I think Bill mentioned school holidays in the program, in the interview you've just had. So the kind of intensity of focus wouldn't be there just yet. No, fair enough. Christopher, why don't we bring you in at that point? Could it be, as Craig says, people just aren't there yet? Or could it be a reflection on the lacklustre nature? I mean, it's pretty one-dimensional so far. A little bit of policy, but a whole lot of character.
Look, well, Craig's mathematics is no better today than it was when he was the minister in the Gillard and Rudd governments, because it's 5 weeks away. The election is almost upon us. And now this is when it would normally be starting, Greg. So it's a 5-week campaign from here. And the news poll, 53-47, obviously hasn't shifted in the last week. The government is definitely the underdog in this election. After 9 years, you'd expect that. But if you're a Labor strategist at the moment, and I was on the 6 a.m. morning calls every day for every election for many years, if you were a Labor strategist, you would be scrambling to make sure that Anthony Albanese doesn't have another week this week like he had last week, which was a disastrous week for Labor. Maybe he's had a shock and he's pulled himself together for the next 5 weeks. You'd expect that to be the case and the Labor Party to stabilise. But certainly you can make up 53-47 in an election campaign. Yeah. And it's happened most elections for the last 10 elections. The coalition has almost always made up ground in the election campaign. The polling is better than it used to be in the last few elections where it's been a bit scrappy. But frankly, it's a long way to go. Scott Morrison's behind, but it's become a real contest, which it wasn't probably a month or so ago. Yep. But Craig, picking up Christopher's point, do you think that there was a deliberate attempt to re-energise the leader, sort of right off the first week for Anthony Albanese, judging by his performance today? A little bit of a momentum switch, a few more front benches around him. What do you read into that, Craig?
Look, we can go over the first week if you like, and Christopher, I won't get into arithmetic. I won't get into arithmetic with you, but I guarantee you the election won't be on a Tuesday, so it won't be.
Let's settle on about 5.5. Yeah, 5.5.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Look. I think there is a sort of a gathering momentum. I'm not going to come onto your program because I know you wouldn't want it Greg, and just do complete advocacy for one side and say the other side's horrible.
Appreciate
the
it.
way I see our role here is to do a bit of analysis, and there'll be plenty of advocacy, from Anthony Albanese, the front bench, Scott Morrison, Josh Frydenberg and so on. To me, these things involve momentum. As I might have mentioned, I was on every day of 2 campaigns with Bob Hawke, and it's kind of a cherished thing. If you can get some momentum going, it kind of self-sustains itself, and I think that's probably what's happening now. A quiet week last week, some areas, we know about that. We're probably not going to revisit them all. So let's just see what the future brings, but I think Labor is getting its message across, and you'll probably see more of that.
Now, I appreciate your honesty. Problems, of course, aren't restricted to the Labor campaign, Christopher. The New South Wales Liberals have what might broadly be described as the Catherine Deves problem. Scott Morrison's captain's pick in the seat of Warringah, roundly chastised for her views on transgender children in particular, but transgender people in general. Does she deserve to maintain her candidacy for the Liberal Party?
Look, Greg, it's a distraction that the government doesn't need. These things happen in election campaigns. What I'm absolutely certain of is that Scott Morrison will remain completely focused, as he did in the last election, and he won't be distracted by it. I remember in the last election, there were Labor candidates with questionable social media posts that were disendorsed during the campaign. Scott Morrison could have gone off on those tangents to attack Labor. He didn't. He stuck on the economy and leadership and stability. He won't be distracted by this either.
He won't be distracted by it, but might he be damaged by it? Because we're going to get to that point pretty soon, a matter of days, when nominations are locked in and the ballots drawn and printed. There's no point of return from there. So what's the upside in loyalty at this stage?
Well, there's a bigger downside in changing the candidate at this point, because that actually creates more of a political story. It gives the media another thing to write about. The truth is that Zali Steggall will probably be re-elected in Warringah. That's a seat that we lost last election. The focus of the campaign is not in Warringah. It is in the marginal seats in the capital cities and in the regions of places like Queensland and New South Wales in particular. So the Prime Minister won't be distracted with Warringah, as much as the media would like to go off on that distraction. The election we fought on the economy, that's where Scott Morrison is putting all of his emphasis. Anthony Albanese will be dragged there, whether he likes it or not. I see that Labor is trying to do a health scare campaign in the last 48 hours. I think people are kind of yawning and thinking, goodness gracious, not another Medi-Scare campaign. And we've been through all that before. The election will be decided on the economy. If Labor can convince people that they are a safe pair of hands, as Craig points out, if they can convince people that they are a Hawke-style government coming in, a Hawke-style opposition, then they've got a real chance. If they can't, if people can be convinced that Anthony is too left-wing, which is what Scott Morrison's trying to convince people of, then they won't win the election. Yep. That's where it'll come. It won't be about Warringah. It won't be about trans people. Whatever the whys and wherefores of that issue, it won't be decided on that issue and on Warringah. It'll be decided on the broader economic issues, as almost every election is in Australia.
Sure, and I do want to pick up your invitation to discuss scare campaigns, broadly defined, Christopher. But, Craig, just to cover off the Catherine Deves issue, do you think there's anything in the Prime Minister's calculus that sort of weighs one seat, namely Warringah, against perhaps a resonance in outer metropolitan seats that are religiously conservative?
That's exactly what I'm starting to think. When the Prime Minister said, no, Catherine Deves will remain the candidate, I put it down to an understandable view that he picked Catherine Deves and he's not going to deviate from that. But contrary to what Christopher's been saying, just today he said, and she will not be silenced. Now, that's different from saying, oh, she said some things which have been deleted and she's apologised. That's the position last week. Today, she will not be silenced. So I am concerned that this is actually quite deliberate, that Catherine Deves has become this sort of advocate, against LGBTQI.
QTI, yep.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that he's sending a message to what he called, remember last election, the quiet Australians. What we haven't spoken about is beyond Warringah and the so-called independent or the Teal candidates. They are in seats where this does matter. I'm not saying it's the only issue, but it does matter. And if I were the member for North Sydney, I'd be worried. If the member for Mackellar, I'd be worried. If I was the member for Wentworth, or in Victoria, even Josh Frydenberg in Kooyong, Tim Wilson in Goldstein, this does not play out well. And I personally think pitting Australian against Australian is an undignified way of trying to win an election.
Yeah, and I think some of them are quietly finding their own voice in the councils where they're allowed to speak anyway. Some of the people you just named, Craig. Scare campaigns, though. Christopher, back to you. We've had boats and border security back on the agenda. Some people saying it sounds like a time warp, but that's there. And then you've also got this pensioner cashless debit card issue rattling around in the last 24 to 48 hours or so. Are we taking people for mugs by resurrecting some of these where the evidence for the claim is decidedly weak?
No, I don't think the evidence for the claim is decidedly weak. On asylum seekers and border control, there's absolutely no reason why Anthony Albanese couldn't simply have said that he supported the 3 pillars of Operation Sovereign Borders. I have no idea why he didn't do that. Instead, he said that
he got two. He got two, didn't he?
Yeah, well,
no,
acknowledge that, Christopher. Yes, he did.
He said that they won't need to have offshore processing because there won't be any boats arriving. So that's a very, very lukewarm endorsement of Operation Sovereign Borders.
You're changing position now, Christopher. You said he didn't support any of the 3. That is completely untrue.
Oh, no, I didn't say that. He said he would turn back the boats. He said that he was very lukewarm on offshore processing, which seemed unusual to open.
Well, I think he was saying, just to set the record straight, I think he was saying offshore processing wouldn't be necessary if you were turning back the boats, which is kind of the status quo of recent years, yeah?
It's a bit of a vote of confidence in the Navy, right? If boats are going to still arrive in between the naval ships, that says not very much about the capability of the Navy, and that's why he was concentrating on the turn-back issue. They should be able to do it, and they have been able to do it.
Greg, the only person who's breathed life into the border protection issue is Anthony Albanese. He could have simply said he supported Operation Sovereign Borders 100%. Instead, he said he'd turn back the boats. Then he said that there wouldn't be any need for offshore processing of asylum seekers, which is very lukewarm endorsement. And then he said Labor supported temporary protection visas when they voted against them in the Parliament, which he had to come out and qualify. So, in fact, the government didn't raise border protection. Anthony Albanese did. Now, that is a mistake on his part, one of his gaffes from last week. It continues to fester and raise doubts in the minds of middle-class Australian voters.
All right,
whether they like Operation Sovereign Borders or not, it's been effective.
Yeah, and look, whether people are exactly on the same page or not quite, they've tried to tidy it up now on the Labor side. Just finally, Craig, because I mentioned it, this pensioner cashless welfare card. Same question to you that I put to Bill Shorten. If Labor was seized of this idea 8 or 9 months ago, why didn't they raise it before the campaign?
I remember Justine Elliott talking about this for a very long time, the member for Richmond.
The senior leadership, though.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying that it has been an issue. And Christopher said, well, Anthony Albanese could have closed it down. He raised it. He did not. He answered a question. That's what happens in a democracy. You get asked a question, you answer a question. You don't do what Scott Morrison does, by the way, and says, well, I don't accept the premise of the question that you asked, and then move on. But on this issue, I think Bill Shorten explained the statements that various frontbenchers on the government side, including the Prime Minister, have made. And so it's legitimate to raise this as an issue. And finally, we saw Tony Abbott, ahead of the 2013 election, the night before, saying no cuts to health, no cuts to education, no cuts to the ABC, no cuts to the SBS, and no changes to pensions. The very first budget that they brought down, they broke all 5 promises, all 5 of them.
And Christopher, you could your side, sorry, Scott Morrison could easily shut this one down, though, simply by saying, not happening, never, write this off, move on, please. I mean, is that the end of it?
Look, it's another one of those distractions that's been raised. It's going to happen for the next 5 weeks. It's actually not 5.5 weeks, but we can argue about that next week when we all catch up. But the truth is, it's one of those distractions. It's not, the election's not going to turn on the cashless debit card, and it's not going to turn on a Mediscare campaign, and it's not going to turn on the views of a candidate for Warringah. It will turn on whether people can convince themselves that Labor will be safe with the economy. And as Craig well knows, having been a part of the Hawke government, a Hawke-Keating-style Labor Party can win elections, but if it can't convince people that it's safe with the economy, it can't win.
All right. Well, the things upon which this election may turn will be discussed much further by all of us, I'm sure, in the weeks ahead. Weekly, if we can hold you guys to it. Christopher Pyne and Craig Emerson, either with me or with Fran, will get you back again, probably as soon as next week. Thanks, guys.
We'll be there.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry for my confusion up here in Port Moresby. It's great to be here, I've got to tell you. Port Moresby is going very well, and despite COVID, coming out of COVID well.
Delighted to hear it.
10 out of 10 to your producers for making it happen. I've got to tell you, it wasn't easy.
Well, they work valiantly, and I'm glad it all held together with sticky tape and all. Christopher Pyne, thanks again.
Definitely.
OK, so coming up, we'll be talking to Defence Minister Peter Dutton, who's out at a campaign event on the south coast of New South Wales. But first, we've seen a couple of national polls published over the Easter long weekend, and we've discussed at least one of them. ABC data analyst Casey Briggs joins us now to make some sense of them. And Casey, what's the headline from this latest polling that you're picking up? Has the race actually narrowed or not?
Afternoon, Greg. I think the race may have narrowed very modestly, but definitely not by as much as some of the headlines we've seen just in the last couple of days. Let me bring in our polling average of the national poll. So this is a model constructed by Professor Simon Jackman of the University of Sydney. The ABC's implementing it with the national polls in this election. I just want to say clearly this is not a prediction or a forecast or anything. It's our best attempt at understanding what all 5 pollsters that are conducting national polls this election campaign are saying collectively, because we get more information when we talk about them together than when we talk about them separately. We've had 2 polls in the last, just over the Easter weekend. First, a news poll, 53% Labor, 47% LNP in 2-party preferred terms. That is, as you noted earlier, precisely the same number it was last week. And we have a Resolve strategic poll that we have calculated is suggesting a 52.4% 2-party preferred vote for Labor. Now, Resolve's only producing first preference estimates, or only publishing them at least. We have this is the implied 2-party preferred number based on preference flows from the 2019 election applied to those primaries. And those 2 polls together, they're both below where our trend was, but it's actually only had quite a small impact. 54.3% is about the average of where we think the polls are sitting at the moment. At the beginning of the campaign, it was 54.7%. So it's only a very small, modest change. And Greg, curiously, you might be surprised to learn that, in fact, the poll that had possibly a bit more of an impact in this average was actually the news poll that didn't change from the previous week. The Resolve has not been the one that shifted it greatly, and I want to show you why. We'll get a little bit into the nerdery of polling here. I just want to pull out just the polls from Resolve. So this is the same chart, but just showing the Resolve polls. This is the one that we've just talked about. The one from last week was quite a bit higher, almost 55% on 2-party preferred terms. But it, as far as Resolve concerned, the last fortnight's poll was a bit of an outlier. Typically, you can see, Resolve polls sit below the ALP trend, and this one's been sitting above it from last time. So what we've seen now is, while it looks like a very, very big kind of drop from a fortnight ago. It comes after an increase that was perhaps out of character for that particular pollster. So when you kind of look at the House effect and the kind of variation from the mean that we see in Resolve, it's actually worked out to be not actually all that much of a change when you consider the trend line of Resolve. So a little bit of nerd stuff there, nerd talk there, but it kind of just demonstrates while the numbers did look quite big when we saw that Resolve poll, the actual effect of the trend line wasn't all that big. Labor remains in, you know, an election-winning position according to the polls at least. Acknowledging this is just what the polls are saying. The polls were not correct last time around. They were almost 3 percentage points out on the two-party preferred vote, and we don't know. We think they're probably doing a bit better this time, but we don't know for sure, and we won't know until election night.
No, I appreciate that. A bit of nerdery there, Casey. Now, maybe in part because there were no major shifts in most of the two-party preferred measures, reporters and others have drilled then into the primary votes, and having done that, have picked up that there's relatively low support for both major parties. The conclusion that seems to be drawn from that is that a hung parliament is now looking more likely. Is that valid? Does that follow?
Not necessarily, I think, is the answer. We should say that the polls that we've just seen in the last couple of days, if they were replicated on election night, almost certainly you would see a Labor majority in Parliament. Let me just show you, we're doing the same modelling on the two-party preferred vote as well on the primary vote. So we can look at the trajectory of the first preference votes here. On our polling average, we've got Labor sitting at about 37.4, 37.5%. The LNP on about 35.2%, so pretty similar numbers there, and the Greens sitting at about 10.7%, so they've been at about between 10 and 11% basically for the last 3 years. They don't really move too much, the Greens. And yeah, this is pretty low. This is, you know, last election, the LNP won with about 41% of the first preference vote. These are low numbers. Does that necessarily mean a hung parliament is likely? Well, not necessarily. It depends on where the other votes have come from. If they're spread out, you know, evenly among a bunch of minor parties that all kind of flow relatively quickly back into the major parties, no, you can form a majority government off 35% of the first preference vote. If you're then collecting lots of preferences from all over the place, that's entirely plausible. If, however, and this is, I think, the scenario that people are talking about when they talk about this kind of hung parliament becoming more likely, if those other votes are concentrated in particular areas behind particular people, so for the Greens, it might be, you know, Melbourne, the seat they hold, but seats in inner Melbourne, maybe it's some seats like Griffith and Brisbane. In Brisbane, those kinds of seats, if they can maybe keep the same primary vote in total, but concentrate it better into the seats they do well in, they start to pick up seats. Those independents in inner city areas, Warringah, Wentworth, Kooyong, you know, a whole host of them across the country, if they can concentrate that vote, that's when they start picking up seats. That's what makes a hung parliament more likely. That doesn't necessarily follow from just saying, you know, nationally, you know, about a third of the vote is not with the major parties. It needs to be concentrated in the right areas for that to turn into a hung parliament. Yeah,
always about seats, isn't it? Speaking of which, we have actually seen some individual seat polls being published, including one that suggested, Casey, the independent in Kooyong, which is Josh Frydenberg's seat, may be on target there to unseat the Treasurer. How much weight should we be putting into that?
Let me show you that poll. This is a poll of the seat of Kooyong, Greg. So these are the blue is obviously Josh Frydenberg, the Liberal. The grey is Monique Ryan, the Independent. We've got Labor and we've got the Greens. On these numbers, well, the two-party preferred vote that they came up with in this poll was 59-41 in the Independent Monique Ryan's favour. On these first preferences, you know, you would almost certainly see Monique Ryan elected. But it is just one seat poll, and there's a few things I really want to make sure people understand when they see these seat polls. One, this is a poll that was commissioned by Independent Monique Ryan. A lot of the seat polls that you see during an election campaign are commissioned by a candidate or an interest group that has a horse in this race. And no doubt there have been other polls commissioned by Monique Ryan, as there would have been other polls commissioned by the Liberals in that seat. Monique Ryan has chosen to release the one that she wants to release, presumably the one that makes her look like a strong contender for the race. So there's variability in polls. As we saw in the polling average with Resolve, they can jump around, they can be volatile. We're only seeing one poll here, and because it's come from someone who has, who is running in this race, we can't really be sure that it's a representative poll. It could well be one of the outliers. It just may not be a particularly good example. It may turn out to be the case. We just don't know. The other thing that we need to remember, Greg, is that polling, we saw the challenges of polling laid out in the 2019 election. That was on a national level. Polling an individual seat is even harder. And I want to take you to some comments from an expert who's studied this kind of survey design quite a lot. Her name is Dr. Jill Shepherd from the ANU. Let's listen to what she has to say.
Single-seat polls often get pretty heavily derided by academics and other commentators, and they deserve all of that scorn so far in Australia. The biggest problem with polling is being able to identify the population that you want to ask, how they're going to vote, and then being able to contact them. And that's hard on a national level, but it's almost impossible on a seat level. We can get mobile phone lists that we think, are related to that particular electorate. We can, get lists of people's email addresses, but it's really, really tough to know that you, A, are surveying the right people, and that B, that little group of people who you've picked from within that electorate is representative of that electorate.
And so, Greg, the polls we're talking about here are typically polls as well, automated telephone polls. They are the cheapest kind of polling that are done in Australia, and generally speaking, the more you spend on a poll, the better the kind of quality you get. This was a poll that had an effective sample size of 678, margin of error about 3.3%, but for all of the reasons we've just talked about, I kind of myself apply a significantly larger margin of error when we're looking at these sorts of polls, especially when we know there's, a lot more polling happening behind closed doors that we don't get to see.
Yeah, and so with all of those caveats you just outlined there, Casey, individual polls, I guess you're suggesting, can be statistically reliable, perhaps more so than the one you cited, but you'd just be wanting to look for lower margins of error, is it?
Well, it's also, there's a reason we compute this polling trend rather than looking at any particular one to tell a story and run with a headline with, because you see, look at this wide range. We've got polls really sitting between, that really wide range of results in the last sort of 6 months to a year. That's why we compute a trend, because the more information you have, the more precise you can be. Each of these individual polls has an individual margin of error. When we combine them, we're essentially pooling all of the polls together. We get a bigger sample size, we get a lot more data points, and we can be quite a bit more precise about what margin of error. So that's why we've got this window here. When we say Labor's on 54.3%, that's what the polls are saying. We're also then computing a margin of error on that, between 53.1 and about 55.6, sorry. And that is a more precise margin of error than, all of any individual poll that we're seeing, because we've been able to combine all the information that we do know. But it's still a pretty significant margin.
Yeah, it is. Yep. Well, look, there'll be plenty more data for you to refine and crunch in the weeks ahead, possibly even leading to greater accuracy if we should be so lucky. Casey Briggs, data analyst, thanks again for your insights. We'll get you back on Afternoon Briefing before too long.
Thank you.
Well, as we've been covering earlier this hour, the Easter weekend brought a flare-up in debate over trials using a cashless welfare card in this country. Now, it's currently used in particular communities to manage the way people spend their welfare payments. Labor's claiming the coalition has a plan to expand its use to more than 4 million pensioners, something Scott Morrison's rejected as, quote, a disgusting lie. Well, Ian Yates from the Council on the Ageing has been concerned about this for some time, and he joins us now. Ian, thanks for coming back. I think there's a bit of history in this for you. Can we go back to the beginning? When did you first become aware or concerned about suggestions in the political sphere that pensioners might be compulsorily forced onto these cards?
Yes, Greg, we became concerned in the middle of last year when we had older Australians approaching us, having received at local electorate level either emails or pamphlets saying that this was going to happen. and asking us to campaign vigorously that it wouldn't happen. We had actually, because there'd been some discussion in political circles earlier in the year, we had had conversations with Minister Anne Ruston, Social Services Minister, about this prior to that, and had been unequivocally assured that it was not had been and not would be government policy. And that was also conveyed to me by the Prime Minister's office. We then saw quite a number of social media mini campaigns, I suppose, at the electorate level. So we asked Minister Ruston to put those assurances in writing, which she did. We also raised our concerns that this was starting to alarm pensioners without foundation, with the Labor Party, both with the political wing and with the organisational wing, and indicated that if they were to pursue it further, that we would not be able to support it.
Okay, so did you make contact, having been armed with this Anne Ruston letter, did you make contact with the Labor Party or its leadership to convey your concerns or to request cease and desist? Did you have any outreach in that direction?
Yes, we did. I think I just said we contacted the Labor, both the political wing, the Leader's office and the Shadow Minister, and we contacted the party machine, and we said that we had those assurances and we could not support the campaign. We also, I might say, published an article on that in our national magazine with a reproduction of the Minister's letter. And that has been on our website since about September last year as well.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up, and apologies if I didn't fully comprehend it. Now, then more recently, it's flared up in the context of this heated federal election campaign. What is the feedback that you are receiving from constituents, from pensioners?
Oh, well, degrees of concern. Obviously, the original feedback we had, and it has continued, it's never quite gone away, but it has flared up again. It's continued to upset people, and what people do is come to us and say, you've got to stop this. Well, we're saying to them, well, we have. If it ever was going to happen, we have, but we've been assured it wasn't. Look, we are disturbed, Greg, that this kind of stuff happens. It happens on both sides. You know, we can equally, or perhaps not equally, but certainly on the other side, talk about claims about death taxes. Labor Party has no plans for death taxes. That scares older Australians as well. I would just say that there are some very substantive policy issues in retirement incomes that could be debated, rather than each side trying to scare people into not voting for the other side on baseless assumptions. Yeah,
and you're fully satisfied that it is only that. For the reasons you've outlined, you're fully satisfied, Ian Yates, that this is only a classic, quote-unquote, scare campaign, are you? Are you prepared to call... Is that what you're calling it?
What we are saying is that the claims that the government plans to make all pensioners on the cashless welfare card don't have a basis, and was explained by the department in Senate estimates, is actually not possible under current legislation. And the chance of any government getting that kind of legislation through our Senate is about minus something. It is not going to happen, and it is not government policy, and I have that in writing from the government.
Yeah, are you surprised? I know you're not a political commentator, but were you surprised that it was allowed to get up ahead of steam? I'm talking about particularly in the last 48 hours or so.
Well, I was surprised when I was approached by media to comment on it that media had picked up quite a lot of it happening and had asked if this campaign was to continue, and I was surprised that it is, because it doesn't have a foundation.
And have you had any more recent contact with Labor leadership, you know, I'm talking about in the last day or so, to revisit this?
No, to be honest, Greg, I've hardly got away from media in the last 24 hours.
No, understood. Ian Yates, thank you. We'll leave it there, and we'll see whether that particular issue, despite your best efforts, continues or not in the life of this campaign.
Thanks, Greg.
Okay, with just minutes remaining, we do have Defence Minister Peter Dutton joining us now. So we're going to cross to him in Nowra. Welcome, Minister. Time will get tight, but I think we can get a couple of quick questions out of you. We have the Indo-Pacific, the US Indo-Pacific advisor, Kurt Campbell, visiting Fiji, Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands over the next few days. Is this a vote of no confidence in Australia's management of the security relationships with countries like Solomon's in particular?
No, Greg, not at all. I think it's a demonstration of the partnership that we have with not just New Zealand and other countries in the region, but also with the United States and the United Kingdom and others that want to have a bigger presence in our part of the world. The Americans see the strategic importance for them to be here, to be engaging, and that would be the purpose of Kurt Campbell's visit, to have that discussion and to further strengthen the relationships between the Solomon Islands in this case and the United States.
Can we conclude that the Solomon security deal with Beijing has represented something of a wake-up call to the Biden administration about the speed with which China is advancing its interests, but also the fact that it kind of flew under the radar?
Greg, I think when you see what the United States has been capable of in terms of the intelligence collection in the Ukraine, really being one step ahead of President Putin at every turn, you'd understand that the United States would have a fairly significant intelligence picture within our own region as well. So I don't think they get caught by surprise. I think they understand what the Chinese are doing, the path on which they're embarking, and the fact that China is a very different country under President Xi than it has been in recent years. And we need to be mindful of their efforts, their influence, not just within our region, but across Africa and around the world. They're heading down a particular path, as I say, and we should be cognizant of that. We should be honest about it, and we should be calling out the behaviour where we don't think it's consistent with our own values.
And should we expect any undertakings, just finally on that issue, any undertakings sought or given to the US delegation that Australia hasn't received or sought?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the discussions that Kurt Campbell will have with his interlocutor. I mean, Kurt Campbell is an incredibly accomplished person, first point. So he doesn't need my advice as to how he should conduct his engagements there, and I'll leave it to him.
No, fair enough. I want to move on to AUKUS submarines. I noticed when you were in Adelaide over the weekend, you were questioned about local jobs there and proffered a view that there may be opportunities for Australia to manufacture elements for the US or the UK fleet of submarines, depending which one Australia goes with. Would that suggest in the US case that you've discussed or are prepared, or the US is prepared to suspend the Jones Act, which is that protective bill that prevents military assets being built outside of America?
Well, Greg, as you know, the United States hadn't shared the intellectual property on the nuclear submarine propulsion system with any country since 1958 when they shared it with the UK. Obviously, the agreement that we've got with the UK and the US through AUKUS is incredibly productive. I've been very, very grateful for the engagement. We have had delegations out here from both the US and the UK in recent weeks to Osborne, elsewhere. And as you're seeing, not just with the submarine side of the AUKUS deal, but also with many other elements around space, around autonomous vehicles, there is a collaboration like we've never seen before. So we'll have more to say over the course of the remaining period in the 18-month consultation. But we're a very significant partner of the US. They are incredibly important to peace and stability within the Indo-Pacific, and we want to continue to work very closely with them because we want China to, frankly, act in a way that is consistent with our values, and that has been the case over a number of years. But we are concerned with the path that China's going down, and we need to be even closer with not just our traditional partners, but with India and with Japan. As you know, India has conflict with China on their shared land border in the East China Sea. Japan is seeing acts of aggression from the Chinese militia every day.
Sure. I do want to cover off just one last item in the time remaining, and it's a shame we're pressed, but here we go. The Horizon Star is being purchased by Australia to ply the waters of the South Pacific. About $90 million, I think, is the price from the Canary Islands there. When do you expect this particular ship to arrive and or go into service for Australia?
Greg, from memory, it's about May, so it's not too far away, and it will provide a great service and outreach for us, support to our near neighbours and to our family in the region. It's an incredibly important asset, and it will be a significant part of the way in which we continue to engage, to train, to provide capacity building and support with, as I say, not just friends, but family as well.
Yep, there's never any shortage of matters to discuss with you, Peter Dutton, but that is all we've got time for today. We'll try and get you back on afternoon briefing before too long, but thanks for fronting there in Nour. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you.
Okay, so that is our program for this afternoon. As we said at the outset, Fran is unwell, but we're hoping that she makes a speedy recovery and can be back on afternoon briefing as quickly as possible. More news coming up in just a moment, so stay with us on ABC News. Afternoon briefing, though, we'll be back same time tomorrow.